Ideologies and Upheavals, 1815 to 1850. The period 1815 to 1850 in European history is sometimes called by historians the Age of the Isms. The suffix ISM indicates a belief or an ideology. An ideology can be defined as a belief or set of beliefs, or a doctrine, or a philosophy, or simply a way of looking at things, a viewpoint that is shared by a group of people who are attempting to explain politics, society, and economics in a way that makes sense to them. So whether you're talking about ideologies as diverse as conservatism, liberalism, or socialism, they all have the same purpose. They are an attempt to explain politics, society, and economics. An upheaval is a disturbance or a challenge to the established political and social order. So what we see happening in European history between 1815 and 1850, the so-called Age of the Isms, is that various powerful ideologies emerge, beliefs attempting to explain politics, society, and economics, which result in upheavals all across Europe or result in challenges to the established political and social order of European politics at the time. The ideologies that we will be focusing on in this period are conservatism, liberalism, socialism, communism, nationalism, patriotism, imperialism, and romanticism. Some of these ideologies we'll spend more time on than others. In fact, I will introduce to you nationalism and imperialism in this lecture, but we will not focus on those until later chapters in the course. So we begin first with conservatism. What is the origin and basic beliefs of conservatism? Modern conservatism originated in the Legislative Assembly in the French Revolution. You may remember from our previous lecture about the French Revolution the discussion of right, left, and center, and how those terms originated in the Legislative Assembly. It is in the Legislative Assembly of the French Revolution that modern conservatism originated. So the basic beliefs of conservatism are the belief in the status quo. This is a Latin phrase, of course, borrowed from ancient Roman civilization, which means the current prevailing condition. In other words, conservatives like the things the way they currently are, how things are at the given moment. Whatever it is, conservatives like the way things are now. They also have a tendency to be a bit romantic about the past and about tradition. So to sum it up, conservatives like the way things are now, or they like the way things used to be or have been in the past. In other words, they are not typically associated with liking change. To use poor grammar, admittedly, there's an expression that you're all familiar with, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now, I would never recommend that you speak that way, but I think that really does sum up conservatism. If it's working as it currently is, don't mess with it. Conservatives also believe in a balance of power, meaning that they like a balance of power between the authority of the government and the rights of the subjects of that government. They also are in favor of a balance of power between the various branches of government. The executive, legislative, and judicial branches, they feel, should all have the ability to check each other's power and keep each other from becoming too powerful. They also believe that people should have the right, through voting, to keep a check on the power of the government. Conservatives believed in the 19th century that the size of government should be limited. In other words, they're for small government. They don't like big, rambling bureaucracy with many government officials and the creation of new government jobs. They believe in limiting the size of the government, keeping the government small and efficient. They also believe that individual political ambitions should be limited. In other words, conservatives don't like strong men, quote unquote, or another way to put it is they don't like absolutist tyrants. In the 19th century, European conservatives liked the idea of a monarchy. Whether it was, and it seems a bit contradictory, they did accept and like monarchy, whether it was absolutist or constitutional. Of course, preferably they liked a constitutional monarchy, but if a country had always been absolutist, then conservatives liked that because they liked things the way they were or the way they had always been. So they're for monarchy in the 19th century. They also believe in having a small, efficient bureaucracy that serves the monarch, that this bureaucracy should be staffed by the aristocracy, that is, the rich and well-to-do individuals, and that the rest of society should be lumped into this group called respectful commoners, who would accept that they had very little opportunity to move up in life and very little voice in the government. Really, it is important to just go ahead and point out that in the 19th century, European conservatives tended to be those who were already occupying positions of wealth and favor. Conservatives in the 19th century tended to be those who would stand to lose the most from change. They did not desire change. They wanted to keep things the way they currently were because they were benefiting from that situation. So this is a bit different from modern American conservatism. I know some of you are wondering, okay, well, this is European conservatism, or we're going to be talking about these various ideologies in Europe. How do they compare to American politics now? Well, today, modern American conservatives believe in the status quo, in tradition, and balancing the power of the government with the rights of the people. They believe in limiting the size of government and limiting individual political ambition. But most importantly, modern American conservatives define themselves as individuals who are committed to preserving the Constitution of the United States of America and to preserving our constitutional republic as they believe the Founding Fathers intended it to be. The next ideology that we're going to look at is classical liberalism. Again, do not confuse this with modern American liberalism. I'll tell you how they differ. Classical liberalism originated during the Enlightenment with the liberal philosophes Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau, who you may remember from a previous lecture. It might be worthwhile to go back and look at notes that you have about Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau. A lot of what I'm going to say here is going to sound very familiar to you if you really learned about Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau. Classical liberalism originated during the Enlightenment. The first real liberals were Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau, the first real liberals in the modern period. The basic beliefs of liberalism can be summed up like this. Again, I'm going to use the poor grammar. When we said conservatives believed if it ain't broke, don't fix it, liberals believe if it ain't broke, fix it, change it anyway, just because we can. So, the main belief of classical liberals was change. Classical liberals desired change and reform. Whether or not something was broke or not working didn't really matter. To them, they always thought that they could achieve progress or reform, make things work even better. So they believe in change and reform. They also believed in representative government. In other words, a government that gives a voice to the people, that represents the people, that allows the people to vote. A representative government, they claimed, was one that granted a constitution to the people and guaranteed certain rights, liberties, and freedoms to the people, and clearly defined the role of the government. Classical liberals advocated a government, a representative government, to be divided into three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. That there should be a separation of powers with a system of checks and balances. For example, the executive branch, we would think normally from our perspective, would be the president, but we have to remember that this is 19th century Europe. So their view of the executive office would be a king with his various responsibilities. The legislative branch, which makes laws and raises taxes. The judicial branch, which enforces laws. In order to ensure that neither of these branches becomes too powerful, classical liberals advocated a system of checks and balances. Of course, this is inspired by the liberal philosopher Montesquieu, who, in the Spirit of Laws, said that a perfect government is one in which power checks power. In other words, Congress has the right to legislate or make laws, but the king could veto those laws, and his veto could be overridden by Congress, which represents the people. So, to recap, classical liberals believed in representative government, one which gives a voice to the people, which represents the people, which allows the people to vote, which creates a constitution, which provides for three branches of government, each separated with a check and balance on the other two branches. Classical liberals also believed in civil liberties, human rights, or individual freedoms. All of these words can be used interchangeably. In other words, civil liberties means the same thing as basic human rights, which means the same thing as individual freedoms. So classical liberals were for civil liberties, basic human rights, or individual freedoms. In other words, they were for freedom of speech, press, religion, the right to assemble. They also were for legal equality and equality of opportunity. Now, we may remember that this, of course, was the idea of the French philosophe and liberal Voltaire, who said that in a good working country, in a country that really worked, that cared about its people, there would be legal equality. In other words, in a court of law, the punishment would fit the crime, not the criminal's social status. That a court of law should be blind to a criminal's social background, to what class he or she was from, should not look at that criminal's particular religious beliefs or lack thereof, or level of educational attainment. None of that should matter. Punishment should fit the crime, not the criminal. Classical liberals were also for equality of opportunity, the belief that every individual man, now we have to stress man because we're talking about classical liberalism, this is 19th century Europe, they believe that every man should have the opportunity to better himself. That a man, even if he was born poor, should not be kept poor by laws. In other words, a poor man should be able to move up in society if he wants to. If he desires a change, there should be no laws which stand in his way, which keep him confined to the lowest level of society. A poor person should be able to obtain education, to move up and better himself and his family in the process, to move up into the middle class if he so desires. Likewise, if he's happy with being poor, liberals would say, that's fine too, but you should have the opportunity to better yourself if you want to. In opposition to that, 19th century conservatives would have said, poor people, you just need to accept where you are. That is the status quo. That's the way things are. You're poor now. Your family has always been poor. You should just accept that. Classical liberals would say, if you're not happy with that, change it, and we will make sure that no laws stand in your way which prevent you from bettering yourself. They also believed in universal male suffrage, which is just a fancy way of saying they believe that every single male, regardless of his social status, whether he was rich, middle class, or poor, should have the right to vote. every man should have the right to vote, according to 19th century liberals. According to 19th century conservatives, by comparison, only the rich and upper class men should have the right to vote. Another classical liberal idea is the belief in self-determination. This is a complicated sort of idea, but we can just suffice it to say that classical liberals believe that every nation has the right to exist in freedom, that it has the right to exist free of opposition, the right to exist in freedom without fear of being taken over by another country. They also believed, and this is a second part of self-determination, that each ethnic group should have its own independent or separate country. This is a little bit of a strange idea to us as modern-day Americans who are used to the salad bowl or melting pot concept, where we're used to a great deal of ethnic diversity making up our country. 19th century liberals would have been against that sort of idea in Europe. Instead, what they think is there should be a country for all French people, France. There should be a country for all Italian people, called Italy. So they believe that each ethnic group should have its own independent or separate country made up of people who are just exactly alike. They liked sameness, in other words. They did not like ethnic diversity within a particular country. They also stressed the idea of laissez-faire economics, which translates as the government should keep its hands off the economy. This is an idea attributed to a classical liberal economics professor by the name of Adam Smith, who published in 1776 a landmark book called The Wealth of Nations. In it, he described the basic classical liberal economic philosophy. There should be no government intervention in the economy whatsoever. The government should keep its hands off the economy and keep its nose out of business in a classical liberal country. In other words, they believe that if a business is really good at providing a particular service, commodity, or product, so much so that they can beat every other company that is competing with them, that is fine. It's almost like they take Charles Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest and apply it to the economy. There are some businesses that are destined to thrive and dominate the market, and there are those that are destined to fail. So classical liberals would have never been for a government bailout of a company that wasn't making it, so to speak. In other words, they felt that a business should survive and thrive or fail on its own merit. They did not believe in government intervention to fix economic problems. They also did not believe that the government should set hiring and firing practices, tell businesses who they can hire and who they can't, etc., etc. They believed that business should operate on its own accord with the government out of it altogether. They also believed in no government intervention in social affairs. Here is where modern American liberalism and classical liberalism differ. Today, government intervention in the economy and in social affairs is quite common. And you can certainly think of many examples of this, I'm sure. The next ideology that we're going to look at is socialism. Socialism originated in France during the period of the National Convention, which was one of those revolutionary governments in France. You might remember we talked about how Robespierre and his followers rationed bread and other goods. They fixed wages and prices of goods and services. That government intervention into the economy during the period of the French Revolution is the origin of socialism in modern times. Socialism can be a bit difficult to understand because it runs so counter to how we as modern-day Americans think about things. But the basic beliefs of socialism are the following. Socialists believe in the surrender of individual property to the government. In other words, they believe that no individual should own any property or any business at all. Everything should belong to the government because the government would do a better job, socialists believe, in overseeing property and the means of production, factories, and industry than any individual person. There are two groups of socialists. One is called utopian socialists and the others are just simply socialists. Utopian socialists believe that people could be inspired to voluntarily surrender all of their property to the government to achieve socialism. Socialists, on the other hand, believe that in order to achieve socialism, the government would have to seize, take over by force, all individual property. In socialism, the belief is that there is no room for individualism, that the community is more important, that the whole is more important than the parts. So in socialism, there is no role for individual wants, needs, desires. What an individual person wants or needs does not matter. The government decides what is most important, and that is whatever the community wants or needs. So in socialism, the community is more important. In socialism, there's also a desire to create a class-less society. In socialism, there would be no poor people, middle-class people, or rich people. Now, this is different from the two ideologies that we've just previously discussed, liberalism and conservatism. So let me remind you, conservatives would have said whether you're rich, middle-class, or poor, just accept it. That's the way things are. Be happy about it. Liberals would have said, yes, we agree, conservatives. It's just fine for there to be rich people, middle class, and poor people. But, they would have said, if you're not happy with where you are, being poor or middle class, you should have the opportunity to change your social status. Socialists would say, everyone should be equal. There is no such thing as rich, middle class, or poor. The government decides for the whole community what every person needs, and the government takes over all of the resources and doles it out or divides it out or rations it out equally among all people so that there are no poor, middle class, or rich people. Now, at first, that may seem pretty good to some of you, but what I would just get you to think about is that in socialism, you have a problem, and that is socialism does not allow for one of the traits that most human beings share, and that is initiative and ambition. Now, it's true there are some people who have no initiative or ambition whatsoever, but the vast majority of us do. We're always thinking about progress, how we can get better, how we can make our current situation better. In socialism, that doesn't matter. You don't have an opportunity to make yourself better or your situation better. The government decides what is best for everyone. In this classless society, socialists believe that inheritance should be abolished. You can't inherit anything from your parents or any other family members, and there should be no profits achieved by any business. If profits are made, of course, those profits go to the government, who then divides and rations out those profits across the whole of society. Socialists also have an interesting outlook or viewpoint about history. They believe that history, since it began way back in Mesopotamia, is the same story over and over and over again. To socialists, history has been nothing but a class struggle between what they call the parasites and the doers. Another way to put this is between the haves and the have-nots. And for some of us, it might be a little bit hard to think like this, but socialists are actually calling some people parasites. Who do they mean? Well, this may run counter to how you think as a modern-day American. To socialists, parasites, and you think from biology class perhaps what a parasite is, it's an organism that lives off another. According to socialists, parasites are the rich and powerful. Socialists believe that parasites, the rich and powerful, have grown rich and powerful off the work of the doers, of the poor and the middle class. So the parasites would be the haves, the doers would be the have-nots. What socialists call for is a final stage in history in which the doers or have-nots would stage a revolution and seize all of the individual property and hand it over to a socialized government so that the doers would suddenly be the ruling class, that the parasites or haves should give way, quote unquote. That's usually how socialists put it, that parasites, rich people, the haves should give way or step aside for the doers to achieve ruling class status. One last idea about socialism is that the government's main responsibility is to provide jobs to all. Some of you will probably recognize that the ideas that I have listed out here as being a part of socialism in 19th century Europe have now managed to find their way into American liberalism today. Our next ideology is communism, which originated in France also during the revolution in that country from 1789 to 1799, particularly with the National Convention. It is very hard sometimes to differentiate between socialism and communism. In fact, if you ask socialists and communists, how do you differ? They have a difficult time, in fact, saying how they differ. Socialism and communism, on the whole, are basically the same thing. There are just a few minor differences. So, what I'll do here is I'll tell you that communism shares the following ideas with socialism. Communists, like socialists, believe that there should be a surrender of individual property. They also believe that there is no role for an individual, that whatever an individual person wants, needs, or desires does not matter. What is more important is the community. Communists also believe in a classless society. There should be no rich, no poor, no middle class. They also believe that history is a class struggle between parasites and doers. But this is where they differ. Whereas in socialism, there is a government that ensures a classless society and owns all property and all means of production and owns all the money, in communism, there is no government. Now, this gets a little bit weird. Some of you are probably thinking, now, I don't believe that's true because China is defined as a communist country and Russia was a communist country from 1917 till about 1989, and we hear that Cuba is communist. Well, there's a difference between communism in theory and communism in reality. In theory, in communism, there is to be no government. All the people are supposed to work together communally to oversee the means of production and the material wealth that is within their community. In reality, in places that we call communist countries today, there is a government. So in theory, there's not supposed to be a government. You know, if you start thinking along these lines, and it can get kind of hard because some of these ideas are so foreign to us, but if you really start thinking about communism, communism can only work in like a small village kind of situation. You can't have 300 plus million people living in a communist community. It just doesn't work. You could not have 300 million people, or in the case of China, 1 billion plus people without a government. So in some ways, those areas are communist, but they maintain a government. Otherwise, there would be complete and total chaos or anarchy. So in a communist state, according to theory, there would be an abolition of marriage and family. Not only would there be a classless society, in other words, there would also be a marriage-free society and a family-free society. In other words, that means in a communist state, there would be free love, so to speak. The idea that it takes a village to raise a child is a communist concept. In other words, in a communist society, as it is defined by communists, there is no role for marriage or family. There would be no Mr. and Mrs. Jones or Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Instead, there may be a couple who is together for a while and produces children, and another couple that is together for a while and produces children, but it's not either couple's responsibility to raise the children produced from that union. It is the responsibility, according to communists, of the whole communist society to take care of those children. So you would not identify yourself as belonging to a particular family. Your family is the whole village or commune or society in which you live. In communism, there would be communal ownership of everything. In other words, there would be no such thing as this is my house, this is your house, these are my clothes, these are your clothes. It's all ours. Nothing belongs to any individual person. Everything belongs to the community. And the way communism is supposed to work, and this is a famous statement attributed to communist philosophy, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That's supposed to summarize the whole of communism. Whatever you are able to do, whatever your particular talent or ability is what you contribute to the communist society. In return, you are able to take what you need from society. So if you need milk, you take it from the communal cow. And in exchange for taking the milk from the communal cow, you do whatever you can to help the community. If you're particularly good at digging ditches or sewing or whatever, that's what you do. You pay back society with your ability, but you take what you need. The idea behind communism is that people are only going to take what they need, not any more than would be fair. In a communist society, there is also abolition of religion. So not only can you not be married or not have a family, but you cannot practice religion of any kind at all. So not only is there abolition of marriage and family, there is also abolition of religion, meaning that there are no marriages, no family, and no religion. Another famous statement attributed to communist philosophy is that religion is the opium of the masses, that the only purpose behind religion, according to communists, is that it's like a drug and it makes people feel better and is therefore unnecessary. So in a communist state, you typically have atheism as a way of life. Communists also believe that you have to have violent revolution in order to achieve communism. Unlike socialists or utopian socialists, they don't believe that people would voluntarily give up all of their belongings for the good of society, for it to all be overseen by the community as a whole. Communists believe that the final stage in history will be a violent revolution. And in that violent revolution, the doers would win and establish worldwide communism. So in communism, there's not supposed to be a government, just people living in harmony side by side. In socialism, there is an all-powerful government. The next ideology that we're going to look at is nationalism. I'm just going to briefly introduce this ideology to you here. It will be the focus of a later lecture. In a later chapter, we will talk only about the idea of nationalism. So here I'm just going to briefly introduce it to you. Like the other ideologies that I've introduced to you, modern nationalism also originated in France. It originated in France during the international phase of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. The basic beliefs of nationalism are the following: self-determination or nation building. Now this is an idea that is also shared by classical liberals. Self-determination, as you remember, is the belief that each nation has the right to exist in freedom. Freedom from being overtaken or overrun by enemies. Self-determination also meant the belief that each ethnic group should have its own independent or separate country. So nationalism is about, many times, nation building. If a nation does not exist for a group of people who are ethnically or racially alike, or who share a common religion, a common ancestry, or a common history, nationalism says, build a nation for those people. So all the people who share a particular religion or ethnicity are encouraged by this belief of nationalism to carve out their own independent, separate countries. It is also an idea of nationalism if you're already fortunate enough to live in a country made up of people just like you, then you don't have to build a nation. Instead, what you do is build a better one. So nationalism is about creating nations for people with a shared ethnicity or shared religion or language or history. But if that nation already exists, nationalism then is about building a better nation, about progress, making it better. Nationalism is also about having a sense of national identity and mission. And here's what I mean by that. A national identity and mission is the concept that each nation is supposed to represent certain ideals or certain ideas or a certain way of life, or you can even think about it as having its own sort of personality. So national identity is about what ideas do we as a nation represent? How are we different from other nations? What do we stand for? And once we figure out what our personality or identity is as a nation, what is our mission? What do we want to do for the rest of the world? What do we want to be seen as in the eyes of the world? So I'll give you an example for the United States. Our national identity, or what we are associated with, are the ideas of democracy and freedom. And we have taken it upon ourselves as our national mission to preserve freedom and democracy in countries where it already exists, and to spread those ideas to other countries where they don't. Nationalism often leads to the idea of superiority, though. This is somewhat of a negative aspect to nationalism. Nationalism has a tendency to divide nations into this we-they kind of mentality, or it's us against them sort of thing. We, whoever we happen to be, think that our national identity and mission is superior to everyone else's national identity and mission. And then if you ask those other people to whom we feel superior, they would say, no, our mission and identity is superior to yours. So it has a tendency, nationalism, to create this we and them sort of mentality. Nationalism, lastly, is about progress, making nations better. In other words, thinking about what problems exist in the nation, what can we do as a people to fix them and make life better for all of those who live here. The next ideology that I'm going to briefly mention to you is patriotism. Patriotism is sometimes considered to be a part of nationalism, but I'm going to identify it for you just as a separate ideology in this lecture. Patriotism is quite easy to define. This is an ideology that we're probably all familiar with. Patriotism, simply put, is love of and dedication to one's country, love and support of one's nation and its mission, the willingness to fight and, if need be, die for what that nation's identity and mission is. It's love of, respect for, the desire to preserve one's nation, the willingness to fight and die for that nation, its ideals, its identity, its mission. Imperialism is our next ideology, and it will be the focus of a future lecture, so all I will do here in this lecture is briefly introduce it to you. Imperialism originated during the Crusades, and that is information that goes back to Western Civ 1. So for this class, let's just suffice it to note that imperialism originated with the Crusades. Simply defined, imperialism is the desire or quest for colonies, protectorates, or to amass an empire. But a good textbook definition would go like this. Imperialism is a national policy that favors extending power peacefully or forcefully over another nation or territory. So imperialism is about a quote-unquote mother country attempting to gain colonies or protectorates or to amass an empire for itself. Of course, the country that does the conquering always feels superior to those that it has conquered, even if it only manages to conquer them economically. The last ideology that we're going to talk about here is Romanticism. Romanticism originated in Great Britain, and it is our final ideology in this discussion. Romanticism was primarily a movement in art, literature, and music. So Romantics tended to be in favor of the following things. They loved imagination, spontaneity, and emotional exuberance. In other words, they really valued being imaginative, creative, spontaneous, just going with the flow. They were not the kind of people who liked to plan and be very rational and methodic. They also really liked emotional exuberance. That means when you read the biographies of various romantic artists, poets, novelists, and composers, you will find that they were often subject to various emotional illnesses and maladies. They are sometimes described as dying from love sickness or heartbreak. You see that they are involved in duels and suffer from drug addictions. The Romantics did not think that the purpose of life was just to get through it as best you can. They were not what we would call even Stevens in personality. Romantics wanted to experience the whole range of human emotion to their extreme. You know, they didn't want to be just a little happy. They wanted to be so happy they felt like they could explode or burst with happiness. Or they wanted to feel the total depths of sorrow and sadness, which is why some of them got involved with drugs and some of them killed themselves because they were so emotionally distraught, and that's what they wanted to be, but then found it hard sometimes to deal with the repercussions. They were also very much into individualism. Of course, this runs counter to the ideology of socialism. Romantics believed that every person had unique abilities, traits, and qualities, and that in life, each individual should try to excel in his abilities and with his talents, that the individual was more important than the community as a whole. Individualism also led the Romantics to lead sort of bohemian lifestyles. They were free spirits, so to speak. They had their own unique sense of style, usually preferring long, matted, uncared-for hair versus the powdered wigs which society told them they were supposed to be wearing. Romantics also loved nature. For a Romantic, there was no better way to spend a day than on a blanket near a lake listening to grasshoppers chirp and birds sing. They loved to feel the warm sun and a cool breeze on their cheek, and this would often inspire them to write poetry about plants and animals and the wonders of nature. You will find in Romantic literature poems dedicated to things like daffodils and clouds, etc., etc. For Romantics, nature was beautiful and perfect. They also loved strange settings and really gross characters, sometimes also creating deformed characters in their famous novels. They also, believe it or not, loved history and thought that history was absolutely fascinating. So many times they focus on, in their writings, for example, poetry, they'll focus on dedicating a poem or an ode, as they might call it, to an urn from ancient Greece or to an Egyptian pharaoh. In other words, they like to write about history in their poems and in their stories, to set their stories against some major historical event. They also liked certain individuals from history, like Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a personal hero of many romantics and had many poems and also pieces of music dedicated to him and inspired by his memory. Romantics tended to reject order and rationality. This, of course, goes against imagination, spontaneity, and emotional exuberance, which is what they're all about. They could not stand order and rationality. They felt too confined by having to be methodical or planned out. They also did not like social conformity. This is because they're true individuals doing their own thing, marching to the beat of a different drummer. They did not like society telling them, this is how you're supposed to look, this is what you're supposed to wear, this is what you're supposed to think, believe, feel. If society told them this is what you're supposed to be, they would often do the exact opposite just to rebel against social conformity. They also rejected materialism. This is because they preferred the bohemian lifestyles of free spirits. They were not concerned with amassing things or acquiring a fortune. They also hated industrialization, the coming of the Industrial Revolution. And this was because it had a terrible impact on individual workers. As you will learn in later material, during the Industrial Revolution, it was quite common for poor people to be forced to work 6-day weeks in factories with 12 to 16 hours common, even for children less than 10 years old. Bathroom breaks were not granted, and during these long and possibly hard days, people would get 30-minute breaks. They were not allowed to talk to anyone while at work except to their supervisor about the job that they were doing. The confines of these factory jobs just seemed to romantics to take out any sort of spirit in the worker. But it also destroyed nature. The byproducts and pollution which resulted from these early factories in Great Britain and France had absolutely destructive effects on rivers and streams and on various animal populations. Sickness and epidemic diseases were common because of the filth being put into streams and rivers by these early factories. So when romantics talk about industrialization, about factories, they often describe them as being hell on earth. And when you see pictures sometimes painted by romantic artists, and you'll think, gosh, this particular artist painted a picture of hell or what he envisions hell to be like, and then you read what the title of the picture is, and it's very interesting. It usually says, such and such factory in Manchester, England, 1784 or whatever. So for romantics, industrialization brought about destruction of individuals and nature, and for that reason, they tended to describe it as being hellish torture. This ends our look at ideologies and upheavals. I have now described and defined for you the ideologies of conservatism, classical liberalism, socialism, communism, nationalism, patriotism, imperialism, and romanticism. At this point, what you should do is take your lecture outline, your lecture notes, and go to Study Guide number 9, Section 1, Matching. Using your lecture notes and lecture outlines, you should be able to very easily match together the ideology with its definition. Once you have completed Section 1, Matching, review those definitions carefully and go to Section 4, Critical Thinking on the Study Guide. What I have done here is I've listed 47 items which pertain to the period 1815 to 1850, the age of the isms. I'm asking you to take what you have learned from those definitions and to apply that information and to think critically. What you are going to do is read each item and determine what ideology or ideologies, some have multiple answers, is represented by that event. So if we do one together, let's look at number 10 as an example. The Hungarians, led by Lajos Kossuth, revolted against their Austrian overlords in 1848. They wanted civil liberties and an autonomous, independent Hungarian state. Well, I know from reading those definitions that liberals wanted civil liberties or basic human rights. So this must be an example of liberalism. But I also know from those definitions that nationalists and liberals desire independent states for ethnic groups. So if the Hungarians here are looking to achieve an independent Hungarian state separate from Austria, this must also be evidence of nationalism. So for number 10, I would put L and N. If you look at another one, for an example, number 13, the English poet William Wordsworth wrote in his famous Daffodils poem, 1804, a host of golden daffodils beside the lake beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, and then my heart with pleasure feels and dances. Okay, yeah, that's definitely romanticism, focusing on nature. If we look at another one, and this will be the last example I will do with you, let's look at number 15. Count Henri de Saint-Simon believed that the key to progress in an industrialized society was proper arrangement of society. He argued that the court, the aristocracy, lawyers, and churchmen should give way once and for all to the leading scientists, engineers, and industrialists so that the economy could be planned to improve the conditions of the poor. Okay, that's clearly socialism, because what he is arguing here is that the parasites, the rich and powerful, should give way so that the poor can improve their conditions. So that is socialism. So that's what I'm asking you to do, is look at each of these items and determine what ideology is represented there. If you have any particular questions or problems with this section of the study guide, you can email me. That concludes our discussion of Chapter 23.